Hello everyone and welcome to another IPT online lecture. We will speak with Dr. Amanda Coffie from the University of Ghana today about refugees as active agents in peacebuilding processes. Thank you so much for joining us, Amanda. It's really good to have you with us. My name is Julia Scharinger. I'm a program manager here at the ASPR, the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, that is also hosting this series. Here at the ASPR, we envision a world in which people with different backgrounds and circumstances are willing and able to recognize and address conflicts by nonviolent, constructive, and sustainable means. And we do so through accompanying people or conflict parties directly, through research, training, and education. So we are speaking about the experiences of refugees and displaced persons in peacebuilding today, and I'm sure many of you have encountered persons, communities, groups who had to flee from their countries, from their communities, who sought asylum or were displaced for these or any other reasons. And as we are inhabiting this space together for the upcoming hour at least, I do want to acknowledge and call into this conversation this experience, these encounters, the richness of place, culture, and walks of life we come from and the people we encounter are coming from. And we invite you to join this lecture in a spirit of curiosity, of generosity, and the assumption as well as commitment of good intent. This really is a place where we invite all of us to show up as our kindest, most courageous and robust selves, to conversations that are close to our hearts and may require care and gentleness just as much as rigor and reflexivity. And now, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Amanda Coffie today. She was actually on a panel with our director a few years ago and stayed very vividly in her memory. And reaching out and getting to know Amanda and her work, I really understand why. Dr. Amanda Coffie is a research fellow at the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy at the University of Ghana. She holds a PhD from the Department of Political Science from Carleton University in Canada and focuses her work, amongst others, on the governance of migration and asylum, on refugees and diaspora, in post-conflict peacebuilding, and more. Amanda, thank you so much for making the time and joining us today. I know that many countries around the world have gone back into lockdown or are still in lockdown. Your family and your kids are close by doing another task, so we hope everything will run smoothly with them and you will also have a joyful and pleasant time with us. And to everyone, I wish us a meaningful conversation ahead.
So thank you very much, Victoria, for that wonderful opening and also the opening remarks that you gave introduction. And I want to welcome everybody here today. We are all in the midst of a pandemic and we are all trying to figure out how we can, one way or the other, move on with our lives. And for most of you, your job requirements most probably has quadrupled. The methods in which you used to do that has changed, and we are all reflecting on our lives as well as the lives of others that this pandemic has impacted. And so I'm very grateful that you've taken this opportunity to join us here this morning, wherever you are. It probably is in the afternoon for some of you. It's probably in the evening for others as well. For us to reflect on the lives of others that otherwise some of us might have never encountered. Others too, you have encountered a group of people who I have noted that even during this pandemic, as states have become more inward, most probably their voices are not being heard. So I find this as a great opportunity. When Victoria and her team reached out to me, I said, yes, definitely something that I would like to participate in and also share for what to me is more than just a research experience, but also something that I think is a lifetime experience. And when I say lifetime experience, my interest in refugees began way back in when I was in what do you call grade two. That was when the Liberian refugees first arrived in Ghana. And my mom introduced me while she was volunteering to help them settle in Ghana. And so since then, I have followed refugees and I've encountered them. And now, as a scholar on refugee research, I am here today to share some of these experiences with you. Um, and as some of you might notice, the title is quite subjective, normative, but it's also because of my own personal interest in looking out for positive experiences of refugees and how we can play our individual roles, either as individuals or with organizations or with our states and then with the international community in ensuring that the positive aspect of the refugee experience or populations that are displaced are also highlighted, and conditions that can enhance this active participation would also be increased so that we can see refugees as not just receivers, victims, passive and also non-participatory, or in sometimes, or what has come to overshadow policy on refugees as burden. I think that one of the things that I always say to myself is someday I hope that the word burden and refugees will never be in the same sentence. So once again, I'd like to welcome all of you and to thank you for joining us today. I look forward to a wonderful discussion and then also to your questions. And most importantly, for those of you who have had encounters, most probably will take advantage of this and share your encounters and experience as well. So with that, I move on straight to the presentation. And you will agree with me that the topic is quite broad, but I'll do my best to summarize most of it so that you can also have time to share and ask questions as well. So a brief outline of our discussions today. We will briefly look at some concepts of interest, and then we will look at refugee hosting and resettlement practices as indicated in the abstract for today's presentation. I will be drawing on my research experience with Liberian refugees who lived in Ghana, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire, and also Liberian refugees and their experience with the Canadian resettlement practices. Subsequently, we'll look at refugee participation in peace building, and then the factors conditioning the choice and role of refugees in peace building, and then we'll draw some conclusions. Most importantly, whether the granting of asylum or provision of resettlement should be linked to peace building as a strategy. So the first concept that I want us to take a look at is the whole question of who is a refugee. Fundamentally, this concept is more of a legal term than a legal term. And so with it comes also rights and responsibilities. However, there has been a question on the social conceptualization of refugees, but for the purposes of our presentation, we'll limit ourselves to the legal conceptualization of who a refugee is. And on that, I will draw on the UN Convention, that is the 1951 Convention and the subsequent 1967 Protocol. And these are easily accessible, so we can easily get a hold of it. For the UN Convention, that's the 1951 Convention that says that a refugee is someone who is owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return. So the operative word here is the individual is being persecuted for whatever reason, including membership of a particular social group. Remember that the freedom of association is a fundamental human right, but in some instances, people are unable to freely associate. And so they are being persecuted or for holding an opinion. And the second fundamental issue is that you need to be outside the boundaries of that country or the state from which you are fleeing from. And because of fear, you are unable to return. A quick note here, the 1951 UN Convention had two major limitations. It was based on the European experience. It had a geographical limitation. And so the original definition sort of limited anyone who could be accorded the status of a refugee to somebody who had experienced events following World War I and World War II, and it had to be in Europe. So by the early 1960s, as most African states were becoming independent, with Ghana being the first south of the Sahara to gain independence in 1957, there were a lot of liberation wars on the continent. These challenges of geographical limitation and the conferment of refugee status on individuals from Europe obviously was a challenge for African states. And generally it was for people outside of Europe or the West. And so the global South had to contend with that. And that led to the UN also beginning the processes of adding the 1967 protocol, which did not change much. And I have to say that states signed up to these protocols and can decide whether they would sign up to the 1967 protocol or the 1951, which for most people was quite challenging. And as most researchers have noted, and from my own experience with working with refugees from Africa, the OAU experience of the UN Convention, I like the expanded version presented by the Organization of African Unity 1969 definition of who a refugee is and who they could accord the status of a refugee. And so I usually work with the OAU convention, which is the 1969 convention, which sought to address the limitations of the 1951 and 1967 UN convention. And so for the OAU, the term refugee shall also, so for the OAU, they take on the 1951 definition and then in addition add up. So that's the phrase, the term refugee shall also apply to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination of events seriously disturbing the public order in either part or the whole of his country of origin of nationality, and is compelled to leave his place of habitual residence in order to seek refuge in another place outside his country of origin or nationality. As I indicated earlier on, these are conventional definitions and they are easily accessible, and there's been a lot of research conducted on it. So based on this, a number of characteristics are associated with who is qualified to be a refugee. I've indicated some already. One, the person is outside the country of their nationality. And so they are not a refugee until they cross an international border. And so that excludes internally displaced persons, which has been noted to be increasingly higher numbers of people are internally displaced, but because of the legal conceptualization of a refugee, they do not qualify. B, the person is unwilling or unable for the time being to return to their homeland because their freedom or personal security will be at risk there. The persecution they fear is directed against them personally or against the group to which they belong, or they are indirectly affected by some internal conflict or attack on their country. So these are the main characteristics of who a refugee is. And once you are conferred with that status, which we'll briefly discuss, uh, states have the right to determine who they confer the status of refugee situation on, status on. However, we know that in some countries, particularly in Africa, and even in Ghana, I remember when the refugees from Liberia first arrived, Ghana did not have a refugee law. And so some have said and have argued that in practice, it was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees who conferred refugee status on them. And so that's an issue, and how African states are able to go around some of these legal conceptualizations. The rights and limitations as espoused within these conventions, and also the what I call the local or state asylum or refugee policies. The first major right is what we call the non-refoulement. The non-refoulement states specifically that you cannot return a refugee to the place of origin once, or for somebody who is seeking asylum, because there is harm that could be perpetrated against that person. So return generally has to be voluntary. And states will then, if for reasons best known to the state, sometimes for security reasons, they are not able to grant asylum or refugee status to individuals or group of people, they would have to look for a safe haven so that these individuals could then seek asylum or refugee status there. They are not allowed to return them to the place of origin when the source of their persecution still exists. So refugees are also, they are free from penalties for illegal entry. So you cannot charge a refugee for illegally, or an asylum seeker for illegally entering your country, because sometimes the source of their persecution is such that the only alternative for them is to use an illegal route. You don't expect somebody who is being persecuted by their government to go through the airport and carry their passport with them and say, hey, I'm traveling outside. And so they shall not be penalized for illegal entry. Freedom from expulsion, except on most serious grounds, which usually is defined as the national security of the host state. They also enjoy civil and economic rights, right to gainful employment, no movement restrictions, rights to education. Unfortunately, the right to education is limited to elementary education. The right to food, right to housing, provision of documentation for traveling purposes, and then states also under Article 9 of the 1951 Convention preserve the rights of the state to take provisional measures on the grounds of national security against a particular person, but only pending a determination by the contracting state, that is a state that is a signatory to the convention. And so it's only in circumstances of national security that a state can deny or can send away a particular person who is seeking asylum. And as most of you are aware, national security is such a nebulous concept that states can throw in anything at any time under the guise of national security. Then refugee status determination, and I leave a question mark as whether it is a right or limitation for refugees. States reserve the right to confer on asylum seeker the status of a refugee. And so sometimes, and there's a lot of evidence, states have withheld that status of refugees from asylum seekers so that then they would be able to withhold rights from them. And so although the status, sometimes the determination is done, the UNHCR can, based on evidence available, provide resources for the refugees or the asylum seeker. If the state does not confer refugee status on you, you lose access to all these rights that I have enumerated. And that in itself becomes a limitation for refugees in terms of the ability to rebuild their lives in the host country. And in actual fact, in other research, I have noted that this reduces their chances of transforming their resources, and subsequently also limits their participation in any post-conflict reconstruction. So there are other concepts. How does refugee situation end? It is not supposed to be a permanent status, and it has to end at some point. Most recently, the main cause of refugee situation or population displacement is what we call interstate conflicts on the African continent. And so if these conflicts end, it is expected that the main cause of your flight from your home country no longer exists. And sometimes these conflicts have ended with a peace agreement, as it was in the case of Liberia in the Accra Peace Accord in 2003. And so when this happens, we will need to find solutions to that. In some instances, the source of their persecution never ceases, and we would have to have alternative solutions. And so 3 solutions have been identified, which we refer to as durable solutions. So the first one, unfortunately, this in the policy and even within the convention, they are just the 3 solutions. But in practice, we've noticed that there's a sort of pyramid with most host countries preferring repatriation and return. So repatriation is supposed to be voluntary. And let me state that it is only within the OAU convention that it's categorically stated that return or repatriation of refugees shall be voluntary. Then there's also the solution of local integration. In the event that refugees have stayed in a certain location for a very long time, they shall be presented with the option of locally integrating, and in some instances, becoming citizens of their home country. And then there's a third option, resettlement. Sometimes we call it a third country resettlement. The research notes that currently Australia, Canada are the highest country offering resettlement to refugees around the world. And let me quickly note that when you go through the data, particularly for Canada that I have studied extensively, resettlement opportunities are quite limited for African refugees compared to refugees from other places such as in Asia or in Eastern Europe. But resettlement is also an opportunity for countries, and as the literature notes, an opportunity for countries to share, and I don't like using the term burden, so I will use the term to share the responsibility of hosting refugees. When a refugee incident happens, as we are seeing with the Rohingya refugees, the surrounding neighboring countries generally receive majority of these refugees because that's where they are able to flee to. So that's the first country of asylum. And when it starts happening, the global community is called upon to help with the responsibility. Some states will provide resources to the host countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan in hosting these refugees. Others like Canada, Australia, US have a system in place. It's quite selective. And so resettlement sometimes is not considered as a right, it's an opportunity for the West, and as I've suggested, to come and select among from the refugees. unfortunately, majority of the criteria for selecting refugees for third country resettlement is the level of education. And the excuse and explanation is that depending on your level of education, depending on your age, then you are able to integrate. So when you go to the refugee camps, the very skilled, the very resource persons are mostly the beneficiaries. And so states increasingly are trying to address this challenge with having some percentage allocated to vulnerable groups such as women, such as unaccompanied children, and also people who need some form of healthcare, which is not available in the camp situation. Then we have the protracted refugee situation, which unfortunately has led to the problem of statelessness. That's also another issue we can deal with someday, and I hope that the center would take another look at it because it's becoming a major problem among refugees. So protracted refugee situation is having a refugee live in the context of refugee status for more than 18 years. And some people will never get the opportunity to return to their home country, but will never be given the opportunity of local integration, will not have access to resettlement, and so in perpetuity become refugees. And then when they have children, and they themselves, they are likely to become stateless persons. And that's also a challenge that needs to be addressed. Now, for us, also the concept of peace building is something of interest to us because for this lecture, what I want us to look at is to look at the notion that it is conflict, as I have indicated, which has become the major source of population displacement that has led to individuals seeking asylum and becoming refugees. However, we have a system in place that from particularly the early 1990s, the UN has led this quest to help states rebuild at the end of conflict that in most instances displays an entire population of a home country. So what is peace building and how has peace building been able to incorporate or otherwise include the voices of refugees? So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I know the next lecture will be decolonization of peace building. And so if you are interested in some of the challenges, both from normative and legal context or practice, maybe you want to join that lecture and then you would have an interesting discussion on peace building in practice and in theory. So the late UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali has released a report which he titled Agenda for Peace, which subsequently became the document for how the UN pursues or practices peace building around various countries. This had 5 major strategies that states will have to go through. That is rebuilding economically, rebuilding their political situation, and also among others. In 2009, Kofi Annan also led a team or commissioned a team to evaluate peace building practices around the world as challenges were emerging that the initial idea of building peace was becoming problematic. So how do we fix it? So in 2009, peace building in the immediate aftermath of conflict report was also released. Based on these 2 documents, particularly 3 priority areas emerges in peace building. The establishment of peace, because the notion was that conflict destabilizes the state. It is an insecure community or an insecure state, and that the international community would have to join in the processes of rebuilding. So in some instances, we've had to send peacekeepers, depending on how you look at it. Some have said they are not peacekeepers. Some, unfortunately, have been drawn into the fight and have become, they had to kind of impose peace on the various groups. Then there's also building confidence in political processes and delivering initial peace dividends and expanding the core national capacity. Um, so peace building generally is seen as an action. It is not a one-time approach. It's an action that is taken by the international community and sometimes national actors to maintain peace. And I use the word sometimes national actors because there has been a lot of criticism of how peace building is done that has seemed to exclude majority of the national actors, and it has been seen as the international communities building peace for the local actors. Peace building is a continuous process. It is a process whose time and scope are context driven and never an issue of a quick political fix. The international community is always eager to move on to the next priority area. And so there's always this time bound. And sometimes, while genuinely the experience of another country could help in the experience of the other, I think one thing that has always come up is that the context of each country is different, and the solutions would have to be context driven. And we would have to appreciate the fact that peace building is a long process. As I sit here, sometimes I look at Liberia and I'm like, although the UN has departed, they are still rebuilding. This is from 2004. And so we are looking at about 16 years of rebuilding Liberia, and the process is yet to be completed. So peace building, like state building itself, should not be seen as a quick fix. Now, as I've already indicated some of the challenges quickly in the literature, we note that in practice, it is quite unidirectional, relies on one size fits all for all policies. It is top-down, highly institutionalized policy, leaving minimal room for local participation. So that's where I come in. When the literature started looking at the challenge of peace building as top-down and highly institutionalized, and the attempt to address it, then focused on local participation. And the local participation was quite limited to the politicians and in some contexts, leadership of the rebel groups that were involved. And so I make the argument that what happened to the refugees who were displaced and in as part of peace building probably have returned to their home country, are they also local participants that needs to be included? And so in order to be able to include them, one of the things that you have to look at is to look at how we have institutionalized it and to address it from the bottom down approach. Then, as Bennett in his famous 2016 overview of peace building around the world noted, peace building unfortunately is very paternalistic in nature and it lacks grassroots support. And so this same approach of looking at refugees as being just receivers, just passive, we see a similar trait in peace building as well, and that peace building is the international community is here like the Godfather to help you build your country. But that has been noted as one of the reasons for the failures of peace building. Now, having noted these challenges, I note that, and based on my research, notwithstanding these challenges, which sometimes are very constraining and very structured, as I note in the top-down and institutionalized approach, refugees in their own way have managed to participate in the process, which unfortunately has gone unrecognized, or very few people have noted this participation. So the contributions of refugees are usually, I look at it from the peace building strategies, the three priority areas. Remittances for financial capital to support economic revitalization, remittances of their social capital in support of delivery or provision of essential services, and their own political engagement. So we start with political engagement. Um, Generally, and in most refugee contexts, particularly those who are in refugee camps, and even those who have become beneficiaries of third country resettlement, we note that some refugees do not abandon their home countries, and they are always looking for opportunities to participate. So I note the Liberian refugees in Accra who found, with Ghana's involvement in trying to resolve the conflict in Liberia, they took advantage of their position in Ghana to join in the peace agreement process. In most instances, when there had been deadlocks among the rebel groups and ECOWAS, that is the Economic Community of West African States, the refugees have mounted protests insisting that they signed a peace agreement, that they signed a peace agreement before they leave Accra. The famous incident was the concerned women of Liberian refugees who decided that they were going to camp outside the venue that they had grouped because they had heard that the rebel groups were not going to sign the peace agreement that had been negotiated by ECOWAS and other people. And this for me is quite an interesting dynamic. You also have those who live in, particularly in the West, also serving as agents, trying to get to their host state, which otherwise has not been part of it. And as I note, Canada in particular was not really involved in rebuilding of Liberia compared to its involvement in Sierra Leone, for example. But a few Liberian refugees who found themselves in Canada took advantage of their position, lobbied various members of parliament from their communities, and at some point it became an issue in Canadian parliament as to the role that parliament can play. And so if you go through all this, you would find that at the level of groups or at the level of individuals, refugees are not just standing by and observing the process, but have found room to participate in it. Then I want to quickly mention peace education in refugee camps. It is one of the major programs that is rolled out by the UNHCR, and it does serve a very good purpose for most refugees, particularly those who live in countries that unfortunately are close to their home country. And so they live in these camps. And then you have rebel groups enter the camps and recruit refugees to go and fight within their home countries. So it is this form of peace education that enables them to appreciate that, look, you need to move away from conflict, and that there is a better way of addressing your challenges, and that when these rebel groups show up, you would have some of them not really participating in it. Another way that this peace education also helps is that upon their return, these individuals who have participated in this skills training become resource persons to be for the state in going around the various communities and helping with the rebuilding projects, particularly in rebuilding political cohesion. Then there's a transfer of social capital, such as ideas about democracy, citizens' rights, and responsibilities. Once again, I would mention the experience of the Liberian refugees in Ghana. I always say that it was a very fortunate or an opportune time for the Liberian refugees to be in Ghana. So they arrived in 1992 at a time that Ghana had just begun its own democratization process. And one of the things that Ghana did was not to restrict the refugees at camps, so they were freely moving around. We even have Liberian refugees who, after their own education in Ghana, became journalists in the country. And so for most of them, they were within the country. They experienced Ghana's process of democratization. And for some of them, returning home enabled them to put some of these into practice. And so they noted that even for a country like Ghana that had not experienced conflict the way that Liberia had, the process was not smooth sailing. And they were willing to participate in the process and to ensure that the rights of their colleague citizens were also respected. And then with resettlement, one of the things that I find to be quite challenging is the process of granting citizenship to resettled refugees, which is quite longer. It doesn't enable them to participate and to benefit from such ideas that might exist in their home country. Now, social capital and the provision of essential service. Generally, this is the transfer of skills and qualification towards the provision of services. One of the major challenges of post-conflict countries is having people with the skill and knowledge to build the bureaucracy that is needed in developing their country. And one of the areas that I have identified in my research is how these states could harness the skills and qualification of refugees who return. However, how are you going to harness these skills and qualification if you do not provide them this level of skill in the host country? And so this is a crying call to the international community to probably look beyond just providing elementary education to higher education, tertiary education, and other areas, so that when they return, they can serve in education, healthcare, policing, the public service, and sometimes as entrepreneurs in rebuilding of their home country. So I've spoken about skills and education. I have to quickly run through this because we are behind time, and I look forward to your questions, and we can delve much more into other issues. Then there is the issue of financial remittances. The fact that they even return, and some of them return with their savings, others will return with the money that is given to them by the UNHCR as part of the repatriation package, for me is some remittances that go into these post-conflict countries. Unfortunately, we don't have data on how much is returned. We also have others who remit financially to friends and families who are living in their home country while they are still living as refugees or have become citizens of their host country. So there's a relationship between the flow of remittances and peace building, and we need to do more research on that. There's a lot of research on diaspora remittances to their home country, but we haven't been able to do that or segregate that of refugees. But there's evidence that there's a lot of money that is remitted, and some of them even begin remitting money to their fellow citizens who are still in camp, particularly for those who have the opportunity to benefit from third country resettlement. And some of them go on to even provide employment and provide income for others. So you have people who have not returned but have established businesses in their home country to help those that are there for friends and families, and have recruited others. I met an individual who has established a hospital. He is a nurse in Canada, has established a clinic, and then takes time off to volunteer 3 months every year in that clinic. And so these are some of the things that they are littered around, and we'll have to commit ourselves to studying them to better appreciate how these, in actual fact, has an impact on the peace building process or the lives of the people who are living within this post conflict situation. In all this, you can only have it when you have been able to provide employment for refugees within your community, or they earn some form of income. Indeed, one of the main challenges for our host states in Africa is that they already have unemployment challenge. And so to allow them to provide employment for refugees is a daunting task that they cannot uh, carry alone, and that the international community will have to participate. But that is out of the way, and that is not even the main challenge. The challenge is for them to remove those policy clauses that restricts refugees from gaining employment outside the camp situation. And in some Western countries, even the restrictions on employment and what kind of employment they can be involved in. And so these are some of the things that we need to take a look at if we want to look at refugees as becoming resources for peace building. So I've spoken, as I talked about their participation. I also alluded to some of the factors that condition that active participation. For the host state, if you are hosting refugees and you are insecure, definitely the camp is not going to be secure to allow people to come in and to encourage any economic activity. So if you compare the Liberians who lived in Guinea and those who lived in Ghana, at the time that Guinea was hosting majority of the Liberian refugees, it was experiencing its own security situation. It had conflict going on even within the camps that the refugees were living in. So for some of us, it was not surprising that majority of the Liberian refugees who returned from Guinea did not have the same level of resources as compared to those who lived in Ghana. Indeed, we can talk about the language variation. Maybe Ghana was more favorable because the Liberians speak English, and in Guinea they speak French. But for me, I think the fundamental challenge is for the host country itself to have a secured and safe environment to enable them actively participate within the host country, and thereby recover the resources that they might have lost as a result of flying, fleeing from their home country. Then there's also the asylum policies. Some camps are very restrictive. Refugees are not allowed to move outside of the camps. The conditions are very challenging. Access to economic activities is quite restrictive. Very limited access to healthcare, education, and skills training are generally left to civil society organizations, which are quite limited and does not really help them acquire the necessary skills and levels of education that will help them achieve that. Then issues of economic and survival activities by the refugees themselves. Then for the home state and peace building partners, there's a need to recognize and conceptualize refugees as agents and not just as passive receivers. Um, Secondly, the state of development at the home country in terms of security. And so if we want to get refugees to be active participants, the first thing we need to do is to secure the home state and the source of their flight, and institutionalize measures that will enable them to participate. Um, Reintegration schemes will have to be organized. There's a tendency to have in peace agreement the return of refugees with very limited specification on how they will be reintegrated. And that is the fear of most refugees. And so we have a number of them not wanting to return, and unfortunately, states have had to involuntarily, and that is to force them to repatriate, going against their rights. So this invariably means that home countries that fail to adequately make room for programs of reintegration, programs that see refugees or refugee returnees as resources, then you are less likely to be able to harness that resources. So we need to have structures in place. In conclusion, I will just draw on a few conclusions for my various research among refugees and their participation to highlight some of the issues. So in 2017, I noted that the capacity of resettled refugees or refugee returnees can be effectively harnessed in diverse ways, such as enhancing the safety and security, participation in political processes, revitalization of economic justice and reconciliation system. So within these peace building strategies, there is room and there is the refugees have resources to individually participate within that. One way the potential of refugees or returnees can be harnessed is through cooperation among all major stakeholders. That is the refugees, the host, the home country, as well as international organizations. And that will also lead to a shift away from seeing them as a burden. The practice of handing down, or better still, imposing policies on the very people for which such policies are rolled out does not augur well for the process of peace building. We have to encourage a bottom-up approach, whether it is in hosting refugees or within peace building practices. The practice of imposing always undermine the voices and the contribution of the local people. And how do we do that? The approach will have to be complementary, and that will seek out the strength of each actors and partners within the process. And finally, my question is, should hosting of refugees be a peace building strategy? A peace building, we are told, does not start when the conflict ceases. In actual fact, in practice, peace building is supposed to start when the conflict is ongoing. And so is the hosting of refugees. And so if we identify hosting of refugees as a peace building strategy, then maybe the Peace Building Commission would also have to look at states that are hosting refugees that need help to ensure that the refugees will be able to get the necessary resources that will enable them to actively participate in it. Maybe this is a conceptualization that we need to take another look at, and how we can bring the various actors involved so that UNHCR is not just seen as providing for their livelihoods, but providing for their future engagement and participation in rebuilding of their home country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda, for this very insightful presentations and sharing your thoughts with us. I really, really appreciate how in your work you put a spotlight on people's agency in a discourse and in institutions or contexts which may not yet be very considerate on that. It's been a real pleasure welcoming you here and welcoming everyone else here. We really appreciate the time you're taking out of your busy lives to join us for these conversations and spending your time and your focus with us. This is actually the second to last lecture we are doing in this IPT online lecture series on caring conversations for peace and justice. And so my heart already moves in the place a bit of also saying farewell. Not for long though, because we're already planning a series for 2021. But before we do that, I do want to invite you for our last conversation in 2 weeks' time. And Amanda very generously has already advertised or has already introduced that a little bit as well. We will speak with Terry Beswick, who's a British-Jamaican strategist, analyst and facilitator, and who's currently located in Brussels. And she will speak to and with us about decoloniality and peacebuilding, which I'm really, really excited about. So it's going to be the last lecture for this year, but fear not, more opportunities will follow, also because of your enthusiastic participation and responses. So Thank you very much for joining us and for giving us this encouragement to continue these conversations with you in the future. For now, I wish all of you a pleasant day, and I look forward to welcoming you or some of you again in 2 weeks' time.